This video is now in session, and Trump 3 days ago announced a class action lawsuit against Facebook, Google, as well as Twitter in a First Amendment case, alleging that these three social media companies or tech companies have violated Trump's First Amendment right to the freedom of speech. So before we actually talk about this and its complexities, we should say we should make it clear that Trump will Trump definitely will not win in this case. We've seen that these kinds of First Amendment cases are moot because they do not apply to the government. When we talk about the First Amendment, it literally says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And it says Congress right there, not tech companies. Tech companies and social media companies are private entities and not public, and not part of the public, or they're not part of the government. So as a result, they don't have to abide by those First Amendment rules. If that was true, then there would be a slew of First Amendment cases against private entities everywhere across the nation. So it's obvious as to why this case will fail, and we've already seen precedent for this happening with Ron DeSantis's bill. In that bill, if I can get it up right here, this is a court order by the Florida's Southern District saying that Ron DeSantis's big tech law, which pretty much stated that that social media companies cannot ban politicians running for office, that law was deemed against the First Amendment and against the First Amendment rights of tech companies. It literally went against Ron DeSantis's own justifications using his arguments of the First Amendment. So it was blocked by a judge, and essentially the same thing is happening here, which is that if Trump is allowed to win in this case, then technically Facebook, Google, and Twitter, are being violated of their First Amendment rights because the government, or in this case Trump, is telling them what they can say and what they cannot say, and what they can do, which is a violation of the First Amendment right. But this is really more about the First Amendment right. First, this is clearly about donations. Trump wants to get his name on the airwaves as usual because he wants to make himself relevant, which is why that immediately after this lawsuit he started emailing, or his team started emailing as well as texting people for donations, and some of his supporters are obviously going to back this lawsuit even though it's incredibly frivolous. But that said, there's actually some kind of warranted discussion on this, and Trump is warranted to start a discussion on this issue because it is very big. It showcases how Facebook, Google, and Twitter hold immense power as to who can say what and who is allowed on these very vital platforms. If we talk about Facebook and Twitter, these were platforms that Trump used in the 2016 election in order to help win in his campaign in the Republican primary. Now, while he may not need Twitter and Facebook as much as he used to, ultimately, if Facebook and Twitter were to ban him before his campaign even started, then he would not be able to be president, or he would have had a much harder time at winning the Republican primary. And the thing is, Facebook and Twitter are fully in their right, allowed to do these kinds of things. They are allowed to ban accounts without any reason, and it's not against any kind of law in the United States, and that's a very hard thing to rectify. The fact that these social media companies have big control over who gets to say what and who gets to have a space on their platform. It's something that the government is not easily be able to solve, since since we've seen how, like, Ron DeSantis's law, for example, was struck down by the courts for literally violating the First Amendment. So it's very hard to litigate this kind of issue in court. But there has been a couple of solutions. For example, for Chairman David Cicilline, who used to be a chairman of the antitrust subcommittee, or no, he was not the chairman of the antitrust subcommittee, but rather, what he stated was that in terms of antitrust law cases, that Facebook was violating it, but obviously that has also not to be shown merit according to federal judges who threw out a case of antitrust against Facebook just a couple of weeks ago. So that's also another avenue that just doesn't work for the government. So it's a catch-22 in this situation. And not only that, but there also is questions over the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which essentially gives social media networks immunity over what is being said in their platforms. If we see the text, it says no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided. So that gives immunity to social media companies for what is said on their platforms, and that creates an even more complex issue, because if Section 230 were to be removed, then Facebook, Google, Twitter, and other social media platforms would be obligated to start banning people based on what they say, because those social media networks would then be held liable. But that creates an even bigger problem with the initial problem we stated, which was that a lot of that these big tech companies have control over who gets to be part of their platforms, and who gets to be part of their platforms, especially for politicians and for pundits, is a very important. It's a very important question. So. This is a very complex issue, and a lot of people said, let's regulate tech companies, let's regulate big tech companies, and make sure that social media is being held accountable. But there are two issues to that. First, we just stated that it's very hard to do that because the social media companies are private entities, but also it creates a dilemma, which is who gets to essentially control this kind of speech? Does the government get to control, which is against the First Amendment, right? First Amendment, or does tech companies get to control, which is also not really good. It's also not a good choice. So it's a very bad dilemma that has to be faced, and has to somehow be solved. But in this age of digital communication, who gets to say what really shouldn't be regulated, but at the same time, there also is a point where this kind of speech can really endanger lives. So these are very complex questions that are very well known, but unfortunately there are not really, as of this moment, there really are not that many solutions when it comes to regulation of social media companies, because you have to balance regulating social media companies and making sure that you're not going past what is allowed in the First Amendment. So in terms of what solutions should be done, there may be a few, but there are no solutions at this moment that can tackle the core of the problem. Antitrust has already been shown that it's not effective. Court cases have shown that Facebook and Twitter are likely to be able to get away with this kind of thing, and congressional hearings really just don't do anything at all. So the most minimal thing that the government can do at this very moment is to try to regulate the tech companies, not through speech and not through what tech companies themselves can regulate on their platforms, but rather the monopolies of tech companies. And while it's a very roundabout way to get to the solution, unfortunately there is no direct way where the government can actually regulate big tech companies. And that might be good because the government shouldn't be regulating speech, but that's also bad because now we have a big tech company regulating speech instead of a government. So it's it's very hard to figure out a direct solution when it comes to these tech companies. So it might have to just come down to regulations in other ways, and regulations in through other countries like the European Union, where there are different set of laws than the United States when it comes to free speech, and as well as regulating speech by private entities. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.